Hello everybody, thanks for joining us again. This is Heath Robinson. I'm excited to be hosting another Topaz webinar and also excited to welcome back Harold Davis to present with us again. Harold, are you there?
Yep, I'm here, Heath.
And we've got you, so take it away.
Hi, everyone, and hello around the world. It's really great to be talking to you. I've called this presentation A Touch of Art with Harold Davis and Topaz, and I've done something a little bit differently this time if you've seen any of my prior presentations for Topaz. The reason for this is that essentially every image I do has some Topaz somewhere in its DNA. So that being the case, I wanted to sort of give some background for where it fits in my workflow and what my philosophy and thinking about it is. So, so here are some of my books, the covers. Heath nicely mentioned them already. And some ways to contact me. I will show this slide again at the end of my presentation. I also should note that I've prepared a bunch of actual samples of case studies, and what I tried to do, as you'll see when I prepared these case studies, is put it at the sort of point in the process which is absolutely crucial to understanding how to use the Topaz products involved. This slide, before I get into some more philosophic and photographic details, shows the Topaz plugin that I'm likeliest to be using, and principally the top four there: Adjust, Glow 2, Impression 2, and Simplify are my go-to Topaz apps. So I like to think about the idea of a photograph shows who we are and how we look at the world. And there's a truism out there: you want to take more interesting pictures, put yourself in front of more interesting things. Well, that's all very well and good, but a deeper way of looking at it is you want to take deeper photographs, become a more interesting person. So I am an artist, a photographer, a writer. I'm also, as it happens, a husband and the father of 4 kids. These are probably, and not necessarily in this order, the most important things to me. Now, perhaps why Topaz is so important to my workflow is that I consider myself, as one of my collectors has put it, as a digital painter who uses photographs as my source material. So every image that you see is a combination of digital painting and source photographs that are combined together in post-production. For example, this photograph that you see from the top of Lempert Dome above the Tuolumne Meadows and the High Sierras, as the clouds would not be the way they are without some additional effects from Topaz Simplify. This is a photo of a view of what's called 10,000 peaks in Japan on the pilgrimage trail, the Kemono-Kodo Trail on the Kii Peninsula. And once again, of course, it's a panoramic photo shot in HDR with 15 different pieces, so the photography is important, and getting it right in the photography is important, but getting things like the way these clouds look and painting in the sensuous softness is something that is partly a post-production issue. With this photograph of Yosemite Valley, I intentionally wanted to create a look that was a watercolor painting or perhaps a Bierstadt painting as like a photograph, and I worked hard in post-production both to get the glow on the mountainside and the delineated line on the trees. I passing through some of these photos fairly quickly to get to some of the meat of this presentation, but I think what you should realize here is that every one of these photos has some touch of color, softness, clarity, glow, something added from these wonderful Topaz effects, whether it is these flowers in water drops on a spider web that are flowing down toward the screen, or this village in the southwest of France at early sunrise. The way that you get some of these effects is by using photographing in a creative way, but also using post-production in a creative way. So here's a checklist. Digital photography is a way to record actual people, places, and events, an accurate depiction of reality, subject to rules formulated in the film era. In other words, if you didn't do it this way back in film, you shouldn't do it. An art form in its own right. Well, I can tell you something. Of these, I'm going to check only one box, an art form in its own right. When I give workshops, there's a certain point in every workshop in which somebody raises their hand and says, well, was that photoshopped? And I say, you know what? The answer for me is always going to be yes. And photoshopped means in some part of the workflow that it includes a Topaz plugin. This is the way it is for me. As far as I'm concerned, it's the right way, and we're only at the beginning of an era of digital art. But, you know, everybody has to make their own calls about that. So moving back to the photography part of the process, a lens is a photographer's paintbrush. That's where we start. We start with the effects that you can do with a given piece of glass crystal, with the given optics of it, with the aperture and depth of field that it has. Now, within that framework, a lot of different kinds of creativity is possible. For example, this is approximately a third of a second exposure where I moved the camera slowly up and down to get the vertical panning effect of the motion on the camera. What I really like to do in a lot of my photography is create something that looks like photography, but you need to look a little harder to see the twist. This looks like a photo. It is a photo, but once again, it's post-production manipulation on the image. The garden you see on the right of this castle in Portugal was largely enhanced using Simplify, the woodcut filter, and the oil paint filter from Simplify. And the clouds there are largely done with a Buzz Sim filter. So truth is that all images that you see are really an addition of post-production and so on. Any photographer in this era who says, I don't use post-production in my images is either producing inferior images or not telling you the truth. This image of the temple complex at Nachi-san on Japan's inland sea is partly constructed in post-production via, once again, Simplify, also Adjust, and also Glow. The idea that I had when I created this image was to make something that makes it look like Shangri-La, sort of a totally lost, forgotten temple complex in a romantic environment, which was not hard because the place really is exactly like that. Similarly, with this shot of a park out in the suburbs of Paris, the trees in there are quite largely done via the detail filter in Topaz Adjust. This is a 30-second exposure of the coastline of the Grand Pacific Ocean and the Great Beach at Point Reyes. If you look at it very carefully, you can see the light from the Point Reyes lighthouse, which was swirling around, captured for a few seconds there. But the whole effect, once again, is enhanced with a number of post-production effects. And I'll get a bit later on to detail my workflow a little more and show where this actually fits inside the workflow. If you put Georgia O'Keeffe and Red Rose into Google Images, this is one of the images that comes up pretty early in your search. I like to say, hey, I'm flattered. Of course, the attribution is wrong, and it's all over Pinterest as a George O'Keeffe. Actually, it's a Harold Davis photo, and largely accomplished using Topaz Adjust and Simplify. I've been moving fairly quickly through some of my photos here so that we'll have time to get to the case studies at the end. This is approximately a 4-second exposure in the Gem Alpha Na in the Great Square in Marrakesh. And you can see in the background here how some of the booths out there look like they're painted. Some of that was the photography because there was steam coming up from them and it was a slightly foggy night, and there was some motion blur, but some of this is also the post-production effects. So I think I'm resting my case. Digital photography is a new art form. It's one part photography, one part digital painting, and one part anything you could have thought of. Again, I'm going to emphasize that I have a fairly complicated post-production process. It varies from image to image, but one thing can almost certainly be said, that there's some topaz in every part of it, in every single image I make. With this multiple exposure here, this is a human shape that's been implemented via an in-camera multiple exposure and studio strobe lights for each exposure. So I think the point here, and with this image also of a woman in a hanging ring called a lyre, part of the point is that creative photography is extraordinarily important. That hasn't gone away. If you don't start with a good place for your photographic images, then what's the point of post-production? But if you do start with a decent place, it's easy to combine surrealist imagery, like this marble shadow with an ocean shot through the shadow, or here's the eye of Sauron inside a marble shadow, or endless doors, one totally twisted, convoluted staircase, or best yet, a spiral set of stairs that ends in a knot. So essentially there's an evolution here. There's straight photography, which is something that film photographers from the 20th century would have recognized. There's recognizable but manipulated, and there's beyond photography. What's the wild imagination of the future? So if you're a pixel sitting there, you don't really know where you came from. You don't know whether you were generated in a camera and ended up being captured and put on the computer that way, or whether I used a stylus on a tablet to put you into the computer, or my mouse. For that matter, all a camera really is a lens connected via a small computer to a scanner. So Pixel doesn't know where it came from. And some of the most fun and actually most widely known images that I've made are really a combination of starting with photography and painting digitally using literal paint programs, and then things like the Topaz post-production plugins for this butterfly, the dragonfly that came before it, and similar images. So one of my theories in post-production is that whenever you make a move in one direction, you make an equal and opposite move in the other direction. I think I promised in the blurb for this webinar that I would talk about Hegel and the digital darkroom. Well, that's a little convoluted perhaps, but the idea is if you're going to sharpen it with something like, say, the Topaz Adjust Details filter, Details 2 is the one I commonly use, then you also want to soften it with something like the Topaz Adjust paint Venice filter or the Topaz Simplify oil paint filter. So thesis plus antithesis, sharp plus soft equals synthesis. In this particular image that's up with the Hegel slide, the Manhattan skyline itself has been sharpened and the clouds and ocean have been softened. So that's something that you often want to do. You want to take the center of a flower and make it look more crisp, but at the same time, the petals want to be soft and painterly. Then the next general principle I have is what I like to call homeopathic post-production. In the theory of homeopathy, and I'm not promising that it's something I submit myself or my family to, but in that theory, if you give somebody a pinch of a poison or something that's bothering them or making them sick, then that pinch gives them the resistance and perhaps can cure them. Well, you know, if you use any effect in post-production at 100%, it probably isn't going to look good. But the same effect at 10, 20, 30% could look great. So only use a pinch. Here are a couple of images that use Topaz Adjust largely in making them. For example, the clouds in this image of Upper White River Falls in eastern Oregon were done using the, what's it called, the extreme exposure modifier in Topaz Adjust. Again, it's a combination of the photography and the post-production because the softening of the water is inherent to the exposure time, but then the background with the clouds is something that I worked on in post-production. I'm known for these imagery that shows translucency and transparent floral images on a light box. The center of these flowers is sharpened using the Topaz Adjust Details filter. The outside is softened mostly using Topaz Simplify oil paint. Again, not at 100% in either case, more like 25%. This is an image of the houses or buildings or whatever you want to call them in the picturesque village of Manarola on Cinque Terre. And I used Topaz Color Blast and Adjust to amp up the colors. I mean, I guess I really need to say also that you can't make, using the post-production techniques that I make, it's unusual to put something that isn't there somewhat in the first place there. So what you look to do is to build out the natural characteristics. It's like Michelangelo said when he approached a block of marble in Carrara. What you want to do is to understand what the marble wants to be and make it more that way. So I also used principally the Buzz Sim filter in Topaz Simplify to sort of soften the edges of these buildings, make it more of an abstract, and to heighten the colors. This is an image, and in fact it's one of my case studies that I hope to have time to show you as we move along, that use both that made extensive use of Topaz Simplify, both Buzz Sim and the oil paint filter, to create the softness in the ocean and also the colors in the sky. Again, as I'll show you, the photography has to be the place where you start, and the rolling waves coming in with that softness are a property of the photography and the amount of time of the exposure, but you can do lots of things in post-production with it. This is an image, hold your breath, of broccoli. It's an extreme close-up of a head of Romanesque broccoli, I believe it's what it's called, and it's shown. You can see a little bit in the thumbnail on the upper right the way the color image looks, and this is an application of the Topaz Simplify wood carving filter, which creates an entirely different image out of it. This, and again, I have this as a case study when we get there, was a daylight image of this nice but a little bit run-down farmhouse in Down East Maine. And I used Topaz Glow to turn this basically into a nighttime, perhaps slightly creepy image. Glow is pretty marvelous. It adds a sort of softness and hyper-reality to all kinds of images. This slide shows gondolas in Venice, and if you look up over the tab on the right, you can see various glow effects that I could have decided to apply there. Impression, as you may know, is a sort of painterly filter. It really gives you palettes of painting that you can add to an image, and often they're named for painters, like there are George O'Keeffe filters, there are Degas filters, whatever. I'm partial, for whatever reason, to this one, which is really pretty radical. There are 3 Leonardo da Vinci filters. So if you want to add something that is really like a painterly effect to your image, again, I recommend the homeopathy theory, not at 100% probably. Topaz Impression is the way to go. The tab on the right here shows various Topaz impression effects. What's very clear looking at the possible selections here is nobody's going to mistake most of these for a straight photo anymore. One point about Topaz texture effects, I use a fair amount of textural effects in my work. Not all of them are via Topaz, but it's worth noting that you can use Topaz texture effects as a storage for your texture library. Instead of having your textures all over the place, you can load them into it and use the software and texture effects to cycle through how they look at various blending modes. An interesting point. So moving to my overall workflow. The bullet points in this slide show what I'm likely to do for image processing for a general image. So there's raw processing, that would be Bridge or Lightroom. There are various Photoshop primitives like editing, hue, saturation, things like that. Much of the time I shoot bracketed HDR sequences, and those need to be combined or worked through. Sometimes I shoot time stacks, and those need to be stacked. I use a feature of Photoshop which has to do with color manipulation called LAB color. Then I apply filters, and that's the part of the workflow where Topaz comes in. And then I generally apply backgrounds and textures to perhaps maybe 30 or 40% of my images. I don't always do that, but where it's called for, I do. You know, another workshop comment I sometimes get is, how long does it take you to do an image? And the answer there would be as long as it takes. If we had a painter who did 1 great image a week for a year and did 52 great images a year, we'd say how wonderful. So I think it's unfair to expect more of photographers, and I'm prepared to allow a pretty long time per image when it comes to post-production. Generally, I do spend more time at my computer than I do behind the camera, but I love both equally. One point about working with filters and plugins like the Topaz filters is that they are much appreciated if they're much enhanced using blending modes. So you don't want to just blend them straight necessarily. It's very interesting to see what a filter like Topaz does when you put it into soft light blending mode, for example, or multiply blending mode at a low opacity, because it's not always the same thing, and it gives you a much bigger palette to work with. I wouldn't be able to do a presentation like this in good conscience without mentioning that presentation matters. How you print, how you keep things simple, how you realize that any work you do, whether it's having to do with books, whether it's a portfolio or so on, it counts. Neatness counts, and doing things in an elegant presentation way counts. So part of what image making and digital image making and photography is about is the context of the image on the frame or the page, and it's interesting to play with using Topaz Impression, where it's a pencil drawing on a sheet. With this rose on a light shot on a light box, what I did here was I combined it with both a background and a texture, so it appears to be on a sheet of washi, and I added my my stamp there so that there's an impression of a simulated print within the image. And it's somewhat the same thing with this image of red buds, a rising moon, and a bird that have been photoshopped together with a background and a texture. This is a light box composition on a white background that's been thoroughly enhanced using Topaz plugins, including Simplify, Adjust, and Glow, and then using LAB color inverted to appear to be on a black background. Somebody said to me, this looks like a piece of Bulgarian folk art, which I thought was really pretty funny. But it is a composition. I call it a geostationary orbit around the clematis, which is the purple inner flower there. So before I move on to the case studies, which I'm about to do, let me just speak up for experimenting and playing with all these wonderful, wonderful tools that we have available to us these days. There's a Zen thought that goes that way, and that is to say beginner's mind is a great thing. I'm sure if you play with the Topaz filters, you're going to find ways to use this palette that no one's thought of. There are so many wonderful things you can do. And isn't photography amazing? Isn't life amazing? You can take these wings and be a butterfly and fly. This is a poster for a workshop where I have a couple of spaces in at the end of April coming up in the southwest of France. And these are my contact information, which I promise to put up again. Here's an image I shot out of a ferry in Maine, okay? Not a bad image. It was intentionally blurred, handheld at about half a second. So the colors aren't quite what I might like them. So what am I going to do? I'm going to duplicate my layer in Photoshop, and then I'm going to run Topaz Adjust on it. And what I would use on this is exposure, color, stretch. So that becomes a much more dramatic image. Let me open up my layers palette here, and here's before I add Topaz Adjust. Here's after I add Topaz Adjust. So you can see the colors have become incredibly vibrant and much more exciting. Returning to the homeopathy theory of life, probably this is too much. So what I can do is I can take the opacity of my layer down, and I can move it from 100% to, oh, where do you like it? About here, maybe, 50%. And if I wanted to really sort of play around with this, I could say, well, look, you don't have to do the same thing overall on a layer. I could go layer, layer mask, hide all, and I could take the gradient tool and I could draw a gradient like this, and that would make the lower portion of the image vibrant and the upper portion not. Just to show you what I did one more time, turn it off, turn it on. All right. I wish I could have everybody on this webinar in person so that if there were any questions about that, they would be able to I would be able to answer them. But for the meantime, you'll have to just look at it up here or ask questions via Taylor. I believe that at the end of this webinar, Heath is going to pass on my contact information, and if you do have specific questions about what I've done, you may feel free to email me. So this is a final version of a landscape I did in the southwest of France with the village of Cord-sur-Ciel on the left. It was shot shortly after sunrise, and I kind of liked the difference between the stark tree on the right and the dramatic skyscape. I can say that if I try. But as you might expect, me being me, the original image had a somewhat less dramatic sky, as you can see there. That's more or less the way it came out of the camera following initial processing of the raw file. So what we can do is we can look at this, which is the Topaz Simplify woodcut filter version of it. We can look at this, which is the Topaz Simplify oil paint filter. And we can look at this, which is where colors really come from. It's the Topaz Simplify Buzz Sim filter. Now, point one, when you look at this, the Buzz Sim has nice sky in here, but you really don't want the tree like that. So this version here is how I combined what I've just shown you to create the final image that you saw. I'm going to pull over the layers channel here, and you can see that what my layer stack consists of to make this image consists of a woodcut layer, which is partly masked, an oil paint layer, which is partly masked, and the Buzz Sim layer, which is masked. Just to show you, if I click on the Buzz Sim layer, that's the part of Buzz Sim. That's my homeopathic pinch that I painted in here. Okay, let me close this one. So here's the farmhouse in Maine. I promised, I showed that as part of my my slideshow. I promised the original of that, and here is the original. You can see this is a pretty straight apple, right? Nothing fancy. So let's look at how I got to the creepy version of this photo. So there's a fair amount. If you look at the layers palette on the right, there's actually a fair amount of stuff here. So I used from Topaz Glow, I used something called Amped Up, and then I added a Topaz Impression Da Vinci twice, and that's basically how I got there. One question I get in workshops when I show something like that is, how did you figure that out? And fundamentally, there's no magic to this. It's an issue of trial and error. You experiment, and another thing that happens is you have to figure out when to stop. When I had my career as a painter, a real kind of painter of oil on canvas and that kind of thing, I used to experience sometimes that I would go too far and that my colors would begin to get muddy. Well, that can happen too with something like this Ocean Impressions image you see here. So with this Ocean Impressions, let's move back to where the file started from. This is more or less how it came out of the camera, okay? And I'm just going to resize things so that you can see it alongside where I got to, okay? So the version on the right is where I ended. The version on the left is where it came out of the camera. Not a huge, huge, huge difference. The child is the father of the man. You can see the image in the image on the right, but it's a bit more so. And to look at the detailed workflow from here to there, again, look in the layers palette. I'm just taking off the effects. I added 2 different layers with Topaz Glow Brilliant Fibers, and then 1 impression of Turner painting, using the Turner painting filter to get there. Okay. So moving on here. I showed this image of the woman turning into the Nautilus shell in a drawing before. Here's the final version. Let me just put that up in a corner, and then we can look at what it looks like in coming to life. Here's where I started after compositing. Okay, this is the composite. And here's how the composite turned into what it did finally. So that's an impression. It's Da Vinci Sketch, and you just put on the Da Vinci Sketch layer. There's what the Da Vinci Sketch layer looks like, and there you go. This is about as simple as it comes. Yeah. Compositing the image like this is not necessarily simple, but applying the Da Vinci filter from impression is pretty straightforward. With this image, you saw this seascape at the end. Let me just, well, it's a pretty complicated workflow, but here is the Buzz Sim version that came into the end of it, and what I did when I painted it in is that I avoided, here you go. See, I masked in the Buzz Sim so it didn't impact too much on the tree branches. I wanted the tree branches to be sharp and crisp. And one more, and then we'll open it up for questions. Okay, let's see. So here is where the photograph of Manarola started. It's already okay, but not really quite where you might want it. Okay, so here it is with Topaz Adjust Color Blast, add a little color selectively to areas. Topaz Exposure Color Stretch, add a little more contrast and color to it. Just to show you what this looks like a little better, I'm going to disable this layer mask and move it up to 100%, and there you go. So that is the first step on this thing. Okay. Moving on, though, I didn't get quite as much as I wanted out of here, so I moved on to a couple of Simplify layers. So to get to the final result, I used the woodcut filter in Simplify to sharpen. I used the oil paint filter in Topaz to add color, and just so you can see what it's like, I'll move it up to 100%, and that's, if I just use the oil paint filter, that's what it would look like. So moving the opacity back down to 18% where I left it. I then have a copy of the oil paint filter to add a little more to certain areas, and I added the Wonderland Glow filter from Topaz Glow to give it yet more of a glow. So, wonderful audience and ladies and gentlemen, I would like to hand this over to the moderators and open it up to questions and answers at this point.
Okay, awesome. Well then, Harold did show some of his contact information. I'd like to show it again. If you'd like to follow him, you can visit his website at digitalfieldguide.com. You can also register for his workshops or follow his blog there as well. If you'd like to email him, you can email him at harold@photoblog2.com. He's also on Facebook, Twitter, and Flickr as david.harris or harold_davis, respectively. You can see those links there. On top of that, if you ever have any questions about webinars, you can always email us at webinars@topazlabs.com. And if you want to sign up for upcoming webinars, and you can sign up for those at topazlabs.com/webinars. Other than that, everyone, thank you so much for coming. Harold, thank you. I know it takes a lot of work to put this together, and we really appreciate your time. I know that we went through a lot of information today, and we got a lot of great feedback.
Hey, thank you very much. I had fun, and I hope people learned stuff and enjoyed it too.